So we're continuing with the topic of the tyranny of the majority, so to speak. And again, this is the belief that, the majority of the people could actually become tyrants in a democracy. That is, they could rule unjustly, unwisely, and lead to the collapse of that particular society. All right. And this is something that goes all the way back to Plato, though he didn't use that term, tyranny of the majority. Actually, that was a term coined by this French social scientist who was studying the United States as a democracy in the 1830s. His name was Alexis de Tocqueville, and he's the guy who, was, impressed by the United States and its achievements in democracy. Yet at the same time, hanging over constantly in his philosophy and analysis was the notion of the tyranny of the majority. Will the new U.S. democracy work? Right? Okay, now I should even go before the 1830s and talk about the founders, the founding fathers, the founding generation. Did they believe in mass democracy? Obviously not, right? They felt that in order to have the right to vote, you have to own property. And, why is that again? Well, there's that connection with economics and politics. It was felt that, being independent in an economic sense means you should enjoy political independence as well. And just a general belief that if you own land, then, well, you tended to, you're not the very poor and thus, the most, if you will, ignorant, right, about politics. That was the presupposition back then. Okay, so yeah, the founders did not believe in so-called mass democracy. In fact, when you think about the Constitution, there's such a thing as the Electoral College. That's just one out of several examples of their belief that mass democracy was bad. The Electoral College is, of course, this body composed of electors who actually decide who's going to become president, or it applies to other offices too, right? And if you know anything about the 2016 election, when Trump entered the office, well, he didn't win the popular vote. He lost by 2.8 million, actually, right? But the Electoral College basically came to the determination that he should be president. Okay, so there's a belief that, again, or let's just say that the Electoral College is one example of how the founding fathers even were suspicious of mass democracy. But nonetheless, it becomes a law of the land. Now, again, I have to say this, Jackson didn't enact any law that eradicated the property qualifications, or that took it out. In fact, there were even some states that allowed the poorest men to vote, okay, before Jackson. In other words, they were state laws that determined whether or not property counts before you could actually have the right to vote. But what happens is, this is the spirit of the age. In the 1830s, 1840s, it sweeps through the whole nation. And state after state began to pass laws that eliminated the property requirements for voting. Okay, so again, it's not a presidential decree or executive order. No, they're state laws that, again, grant mass democracy. Some were resistant. There were some states like Virginia that waited for quite a while. It was one of the last states to grant mass democracy because of the entrenched aristocracy, so to speak. I use that term, of course, with quotes. In Virginia, where, they saw the elite as really in charge, but eventually they gave in. Okay, so this is what happens. And again, in accordance with the redefinition of Republican citizenship, well, let's remember that earlier, before Jacksonian democracy, that way of thinking of democracy rested upon ownership of property, right? Now with Jacksonian freedom, democracy no longer rests upon ownership of property, but it does rest upon the individual freedom of the person. In other words, ownership of the self. You're not a slave. If you're not a slave, you can vote. And of course, you have to think gender and race, right? Um, Non-whites, of course, couldn't vote back then. And also, women could not vote, right? That's half the population, if you recall, right? As we discussed in terms of race, gender, and class, and even we the people, um, in a different topic. Right? Okay, so, but nonetheless, it is a step forward in terms of mass democracy uh, in the history of democracy in our country. So there is still political exclusion, as I mentioned. All right, so uh, what happens here is, as mentioned in that quote, as democracy triumphed, the grounds for exclusion shifted from economic dependency to natural incapacity. So, how can we analyze this argument based on race, gender, and class? Well, here's how it goes. First of all, I should say that first phrase, as democracy triumphed, we're specifically referring to Jacksonian democracy. Okay, so as Jacksonian democracy triumphed, there is still exclusion, right? That's what it says here. There are still grounds for excluding people from the vote, but there's a shift in terms of the conditions for that exclusion. Okay, it used to be based on economic dependency. Right now, again, this goes back to the idea pre-Jacksonian, whereby it was felt that if you did not own land, then you were economically beholden or dependent upon the landowner, right? And this goes all the way back to the colonial era, as we discussed way back when. But now shifting from that idea to, we could still exclude during the Jacksonian period, right? But let's exclude not on economic dependency, but based on natural incapacity. Okay, so what's happening here is when you think of it in terms of race, gender, and class, well, let's start with social class, right? Social class is, of course, economics. Social class does apply to pre-Jacksonian, as mentioned here, where it was based on economic dependency, or exclusion was based on political dependency. But now, after the Jacksonian wave, well, we see it shifting to race and gender. Okay, so the argument that's going to be made is, as we no longer exclude based on social class, that is economic dependency, we must still exclude, right? And we'll exclude based on race and gender. So those persons who aren't white will be excluded, but it's based on something called, quote, natural incapacity. And what does that refer to? It means natural inability, right, to participate in the so-called art of democracy, right? And this means they're basically, well, it was a presupposition or assumption that persons of color were inferior, intellectually inferior, right? So they should be excluded. And the same applies to gender, right? Should we still exclude women during the Jacksonian period? The answer is yes. And then the justification, well, it's not based on economic dependency, right? It's, again, just like race, based on natural incapacity. That is, women were naturally inferior, intellectually inferior, therefore they should be excluded from Jacksonian freedom. And as we know, well, women will be granted the vote in 1920 with the 19th Amendment. So it's going to be decades, about 100 years, actually, almost 100 years until women will be granted the right to vote. For African American men, it'll be until the 14th Amendment in 1869, right after the Civil War. So it'll be decades before those two classes will be allowed to vote. Now, in terms of race, what about Native Americans? What's going on with them? Well, here's the sad truth, is during Jackson's administration, there's going to be this consequential event, which is Indian removal. And if you could look at this slide here on this map, here in the South, you have states like Alabama, Florida, Mississippi, Arkansas. This is called like the Delta South, right? And here's the story behind it. Well, these areas were occupied by Native Americans or before Jackson was president. Yet at the same time, the United States is expanding. And that's not only in terms of geography, because these are already states, right? But commercially, economically, we're expanding. And the main cash crop here became cotton. It was called king cotton back then, okay? Because it was, or white gold was another name for it, because it was the main cash export, or crop export that, was the main cash source, if you will, profit. So we needed to expand our cotton land, so to say, right? And we felt it should be expanded into these states here, like Alabama, Mississippi, so forth. Yet it's occupied by Native Americans. In particular, there's something called the 5 civilized tribes. Notice the term civilized, right? They considered themselves more assimilated to Western culture or American culture compared to other Indian tribes. Why? They had some semblance of a constitution even with their nations. Some of them actually adopted English, right? So, or Western education too. So they felt they were more civilized. And, they had a population of about 60,000 in these states like Georgia, Alabama, Florida, North Carolina. Now, they happened to occupy the land that at the same time was seen as possible cotton land. So what happens basically, to cut to the chase, is, yes, there is some successful resistance from some Native Americans and even some Supreme Court justices, right, that actually want to protect the Indians, and they announced that in their Supreme Court decisions. But by 1832, you see this important Supreme Court case called Worcester versus Georgia. And basically, even though the Supreme Court still acknowledges the sovereignty of Indians, Jackson refuses to acknowledge what the Supreme Court announces. And he begins to forcibly remove Indians from their ancestral homelands here in the southeast of the United States. Okay, and this happens by 1838 and 1839. And this leads to the infamous Trail of Tears, where you see 18,000 Native American men, women, and children basically rounded up, forced to uproot themselves from their ancestral lands and journey over here to the Arkansas Territory, okay, also called Indian Territory back then. And 25% of them died on the Trail of Tears, which is why it was called the Trail of Tears. So what happens basically is Indian removal was done for the expansion of the cotton industry. So what happened here in terms of the soil, Indian soil was replaced by slave soil, meaning, who's going to occupy these lands? Slaves working on those cotton plantations, right? So when it came to democracy, obviously, persons of color, slaves, but certainly Native Americans, they're experiencing the opposite. You see the explosion of slavery because of cotton, as well as Indian removal. These are hardly democratic.